Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Dana Swift, and good evening, and thank you for tuning in. We're here at Books and Books, an independently owned bookstore in Miami, Florida, and we're so delighted to welcome you to this virtual evening with Julio Anta and Jacoby Salcedo to discuss the new book, Frontera, published with our friends at HarperCollins. And thank you to our authors and our wonderful audience for being part of this. And now a little bit about our guest. Julio is a Cuban and Colombian-American author from Miami, Florida. He currently resides in New York City, where he works to tell narratively rich stories about diverse Latinx characters for readers of all ages. He is best known for his comic book series Home, published by Image Comics, and his work at Marvel and DC Comics. Forthcoming work includes the young adult novel Frontera, which we're going to talk about today, and Second Generation Blues from Harper Alley, and middle grade graphic novel Speak Up Santiago and its sequel from Random House, and Si Sen Puedo, a non-fiction graphic novel from 10 Speed Press. You guys just have such impressive bios. And then we also have Jacoby. He is a comic book illustrator who's based in Portland, Oregon. He's the co-creator of the HarperCollins YA graphic novel Frontera with frequent collaborator Julio. He is also the artist of the Dark Horse miniseries It's Only Teenage Wasteland, and with the writer Kurt Praise. And Jacoby also has been featured in multiple comic anthologies such as DC's Legend of Bloom, Panel X Panel, Graphic Mundo's COVID Chronicles, and A Wave Blue World Young Men in Love. And then last but not least, our amazing moderator tonight is Johnnie Christmas. He's a #1 New York Times bestselling and award-winning graphic novelist, also best known for his co-creating the series Angel Catbird with celebrated writer Margaret Atwood. His other works include Tartarus, Crema, Firebug, Sheltered, and the graphic novel adaptation of Alien 3, Swim Team is his middle grade graphic novel. Find him online at johnnychristmas.com. And just a quick reminder to all that throughout the evening's broadcast, you can post questions. It's just a button below at that little thing that says Ask Question. And I will pop back on screen and facilitate those questions. And you're also feel free to ask things in the chat section. We just ask that you be kind. And of course, you can always buy a copy through Books and Books of Frontera. And the button to buy is right below. And without further ado, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to get away and let you guys have all the fun.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. And are you guys hearing an echo? Or is it just me?
I think we're good.
Voices in my head. All right. So thanks so much for you all joining. And I'm going to take these out because I'm hearing the echo.
Can't hear you now. I think you're muted. No, can't hear you. While we're waiting for Johnnie, though, we can point out that Jacoby's name says Larry on it. It is, in fact, Jacoby, the artist on the book. But maybe just to start off, Jacoby and I can just tell you, anyone who's tuning in, a little bit about the book. And then we can jump in with Johnnie. So for those of you who haven't read, this is Frontera. It is Jacoby and I's young adult graphic novel debut, and it is about a boy named Mateo who is on a journey back home to the United States, to Arizona. And to get back home, he has to go on a journey across the Sonoran Desert in the border that divides the U.S. and Mexico. And along the way, he meets a ghost named Guillermo, and Guillermo is the ghost of a migrant that died over 50 years ago in the very same desert. And together they go on this journey, this kind of supernatural border adventure through the desert. But yeah, so that's a little bit about the book. Jacoby and I have been working on it for quite some time.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Perfect.
You're back.
Sorry, everybody, for a technical glitch. Unfortunate, but
All good.
in virtual talks. Can you thank you both for joining us, and can you start off? Tell us what made you want to tell the story.
Yeah, I think a lot of my work, certainly the work that Jacoby and I do together, is often it's always inspired by true events and real, kind of my feelings about what's going on, in the world. And with this one, it started with a lot of anger. This book, Johnnie, as you know, graphic novels take a long time to make. So this is a book that we started working on in 2020. And, I started pitching the book in 2019 when we were in the middle of the Trump administration. And it felt like things were just getting worse and worse. And every day there was something new to be outraged about. And unfortunately, as we continued working on the book and today, things have not gotten better. They've gotten worse in a lot of ways. And that's what inspired the initial kind of kernel of the idea, which was initially just a story about a ghost roaming the desert, the Sonoran Desert, where he died 50 years ago. And then it evolved from there. And we eventually added the Mateo, who's our point of view character. We decided to tell this story that is across generations and decades and can show how the border has both changed in many ways, how it's been militarized and become more dangerous, but in many ways it's also stayed the same. So that's kind of how we got the idea to do this book.
Speaking of the border and the geography, can you tell me about on Mateo's path? What was the emotional and geographical, paths that you carved? Like, how realistic are the geographical paths that we followed, and the emotional landscape of, some undertaking this journey? I know you talked to migrants. I'd like to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, the geographical landscape is, it's inspired by the real life Sonoran Desert. We used a lot of photo, video reference, as well as just stories from people who have made the journey across that border, which kind of, in a storytelling capacity, kind of posed an interesting problem, which is, the desert, while it's beautiful and dangerous and scary and all these things at the same time, it's kind of tough to fill 240 pages with the same desert setting, right? So we treated this as an adventure story, not too dissimilar from like an Indiana Jones movie or any adventure story, where we're kind of segmented into different parts where there's different challenges and different characters introduced. And to keep it exciting, we really dug into the history of the desert, which is a history of the border changing, first obviously being indigenous lands, then being Mexican, then being American, and the way that, the indigenous population there, the Tohono O'odham, still exists, and they have a reservation there. So we integrated that. We also, there's a lot of magical realism in the book, and surrealism. So there's, parts of the book where we go into the past of both characters. So that certainly helped kind of break up just all the desert scenes, walking through the desert. But yeah, so that was, that's 100%, based on the real desert. And then emotionally, there is, for all of the, I don't know what you can maybe perceive as like barren desert, it's inhabited by so many different people and animals, and all of those that posed a threat or a challenge to Mateo, our main character, were kind of all corresponding with where he was emotionally too.
And Jacoby did it masterfully, the mapping of the desert and having it not feel the same. It felt as you're going along the journey, even though it's desert, the desert's changing as Mateo's changing. Speaking of Mateo, can you tell us a bit about him? As there's something very Miami about, in my experience of growing up in Miami, where Mateo is an American, but his status as a contributing member of our society and his legal status are in conflict, at least in terms of the legal system. Can you tell us a little bit about him as a person and this conflict that sets him out on his journey?
Yeah. So Mateo is he's a teenager who, without spoiling too much, he's under the impression that he was born in the United States. And he is, in every sense of that word, an American kid, even in the ways that, he's pretty bratty throughout the book, and hard-headed, and doesn't really follow directions really well. But at the same time, he's also very headstrong, and he's determined to make it back home to Arizona. So I think, his legal status and, his identity are kind of intrinsically connected, because, he does find out that he's undocumented sometime before the book started. And we see that moment in a flashback. And that's why he's trying to make it back to the US. And I think like that determination, but also that identity of belonging and how, he sees himself as an American kid, and he spent his life living there. His parents contributed to, their community. He deserves to be there just like any other kid. And he's willing to do anything to get there. And oftentimes, that's what causes the conflict in the book also, because, he's like 16 years old, and he thinks he knows everything at the beginning of the book. He doesn't want to, get advice from his parents or from the people who are supposed to help get him to the US. So yeah, I think, his personality and his status are kind of intertwined in a way that's really important to his character.
Yeah, it was very much growing up in Miami. I knew so many people who had that scenario. I myself, my parents are from the Caribbean. I was born in the Caribbean. And many of my friends from, all over the Caribbean, whether it be English speaking, Spanish speaking, or French speaking, there were many people I knew who had a scenario like that, and I have not seen that in a graphic novel. And it was really kind of refreshing to see that reflected, because it's a story of so many of us. And can you tell us a bit about Guillermo and differing ideas of Mexican American masculinity across time? It was very interesting how you had that seamlessly woven into the fabric of the story in a way that was really, again, refreshing. I hadn't seen that before, but without pointing too much on it. It was all woven into his character. It was very character based.
Yeah. So Guillermo, he was an interesting character to write, because he's definitely, and we can get into that afterwards about the masculinity aspect of it. But he's also so much more mature, because he is, 70 years old, even though he is a teenager who's been stuck in the desert for over 50 years. So with the character of Guillermo, he's someone who participated in the Bracero program during World War II, which we explained in the book, but for those who haven't read it yet, the Bracero program was a U.S. Sponsored program that essentially reached out in partnership with the Mexican government to Mexican nationals to essentially fill the jobs of Americans who were out fighting the war. And oftentimes, this was, in agriculture and in factories. And in Guillermo's case, he and his father came to work on a farm in the U.S. And like happens a lot of times with immigrants within the United States. Our presence and the work that we do is necessary to making this economy run of this country. But as soon as we're not needed anymore, we're shown the back door. And that's exactly what happened with the Bracero program. Because after the Bracero program came the Operation Wetback deportations, which was essentially, some of these people had been in the U.S. for 10, 15 years working in the Bracero program. And then when it was over, they were deported back to Mexico. And that was the situation of Guillermo and his father. And then, along the way, while he was working on this farm, he met another boy, and they fell in love, and they had this really, meaningful relationship. And when Guillermo had to go back to Mexico, he decided that he wanted to come back and, be with this person that he fell in love with. And unfortunately, that is the journey that led to his death in the desert 50 years ago. So, there's definitely a different understanding of masculinity between Mateo and Guillermo. But I think it's also important to mention that there's also so much more maturity in Guillermo because, not only has he lived these 50 extra years, but he's also seen how the border has changed over these 50 years. And he's seen so much death, so much unnecessary death, and cruelty. And I think that's shaped his understanding of life in general, I think.
Yeah. Speaking of cruelty, and I don't want to give too much away, but there are acts of cruelty on the journey that Mateo experiences firsthand and is told about from Guillermo, by Guillermo. And there's this one particularly heartbreaking situation. And I'm trying to find a way to ask this without giving too much away. But are such acts very common? I know earlier before we got on, you were telling me that much of this, everything in the book is true. Mm-hmm. So that leads me to believe that acts of sabotage and cruelty to people wandering across, or not even wandering, making their way across a desert, yep, that people would try to sabotage and stymie their progress in a way that would harm them. Mm-hmm. What have you encountered in your research mm-hmm. of acts like that? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I think I know the one you're talking about, and I'll just I don't think it's a big spoiler, so we'll talk about it because that's how that was actually the entry point to the book for me. Was learning about this. So the Sonoran Desert is a desert, right? So it's a very dangerous place to cross, whether it's from the wildlife or the elements, the lack of water and the heat. So what kind of brought me to this story initially was learning about these groups that set up what's called water aid stations throughout the desert. And this is sometimes, just a flag planted in the ground and a bunch of water bottles and water gallons that are there for migrants or anyone who happens to be in the desert that needs it. And sometimes they're much larger, they're big water tanks. This is as a migrant crossing the desert, this is a lifeline for you. Because you might be walking through the desert for 2 days. And that's if, you are on track, you know exactly where you're going and there's no problems. Sometimes, people will get lost in the desert and they'll be there for a week, and they'll unfortunately starve to death and so these water aid stations are a lifeline to them. And unfortunately, they're often sabotaged by the Border Patrol, by non-governmental groups. And what brought me to the story was learning about these groups that put these out. And in learning about these groups, I saw videos that it's literally footage of Border Patrol agents, slicing open gallons of water, destroying them and reveling in it too, they're having a great time doing this. And that's, like I said, it's literally people's lifeline when they're out there. So that's just one example, but yeah, like I said before we started, with the exception of the ghost, every single thing in this book is based in reality. Whether it's the water aid stations, whether it's the Bracero program, or I don't we don't name it in the book, but in one of the flashbacks, we see the originally before the Federal Border Patrol, the KKK were the first border patrol, and they had what was called just the KKK Border Patrol, and they would go out there in their cars and trucks and try to find migrants. They killed many of them. Others they turned over to the police. But that was essentially the start of the Border Patrol. And that's what we show in that scene of the book. If you look closely, you can see the logo that they used that we found from reference photos. But yeah, everything is just inspired by research or from stories. And I think that was what really grounded the book and the idea for us.
Why a ghost story? As a reader, I thought it was very interesting to have the history of the Bracero program, for instance, brought forward, not as a bit of history, but as a bit of as something that someone actually encountered. Guillermo lived this, so when he's telling you it's his life he's talking about. So I thought that was extremely effective that way in bringing the past to the present. But also, there's this beautiful magic realism element to it. So I'd just like to hear from both of you, why a ghost story?
Yeah, I mean, I can speculate because when I got the idea, it was always a ghost. It started with the ghost, even before we got Mateo. The idea that there was a ghost roaming the desert and he was stuck there for half a century was always the idea. But speculating, my family, or one side of my family, is from Colombia. And obviously, the roots of magical realism, or some of the most famous instances of magical realism come from Colombia. It's a big part of kind of like my early reading as a kid and a teen. And I also love supernatural stuff. Like I grew up loving everything about aliens and paranormal detectives and ghost hunters and all that kind of stuff. So I can speculate that that's kind of where it came from. But yeah, it's one of those things where the idea was not fully formed, but the ghost was always there from the beginning.
There was something that you made a strong effort that all the characters that would have been background characters in another book were named. They had their own stories. Mm-hmm. We are, invited to hear about their stories and their trajectories. Mm-hmm. And it reminded me a lot of those the stories from the Middle Ages, where someone's on a pilgrimage, mm-hmm. and you get to learn about everyone on the way. It was this beautiful way of learning about all these people who would be background characters, mm-hmm. but also it was in this line of, storytelling. Yeah. Tell us a bit about that. Yeah. And the choice to do that.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point about, they would have just been background characters in another story. And I think we've seen that in, most stories that have migrants in it in any way. I think, like I mentioned earlier about it being an adventure story, or I think using your example, like an Odyssey, where there's moments where we encounter new characters and eventually we move on and we get to the next one. There's I feel like there are at least a handful of characters in this book that could have their own stories, their own books, and I think that does speak to, I think with most, marginalized or racialized groups, there's the desire to speak of them each as their own monolith, and we're I think all of us are familiar with that. But I think especially when you look at a community like the Latino community and the migrant community, a lot of people assume that we all, had the same journey and we're all, that we're all the same. And I think even within the context of migrants who are crossing the Sonoran Desert, you're going to hear, for every person that you meet, you're going to hear a different story, and they're not all coming from Mexico. They're coming from different places. They're coming for different reasons, from different income statuses in their country. And I think all of that affects that, and like you and I, Johnny, like growing up in Miami, there is different generations of migration. There's different countries that people come from, different cultures and languages. And that's one of the things I wanted to show in this book, that there's no monolith. Everyone has, Mateo grew up in the United States. One of the characters that we meet right at the end of the book that are part of the migrant group that he helps, they have one family member that lives in the U.S. And then obviously we have Darcy, who's indigenous to the Sonoran Desert. And her story is totally different than everybody else's, especially when it comes to the border, because, her tribe, her reservation, we often hear, the border, I didn't cross the border crossed me. That is a perfect example of that. So, I think there's so many stories that could be told. And often I feel like, there's so many stories that I want to tell. But I think with all these different characters in the book, it was a good, a good exercise in, I don't want to say stuffing the book, but getting all these different stories in that maybe wouldn't get their own book in, another scenario.
It's really effective. Tell us about the so-called coyote, and who we encounter in the book is much different than the portrayals that we see in popular culture. Tell us a little bit about this character, who genuinely cares about Mateo's safety, and what you found in your own research about coyotes who help carry people across the desert.
Yeah. So this is a character named Juan Javier, who is the name of a good friend of mine who I grew up with in Miami. He's a teenager, probably 16 or 17, like Mateo. The stories that you hear about, coyotes and people who smuggle people across the border, a lot of them are true. It is extremely dangerous. And oftentimes these people will take advantage of you. They'll, tell you it costs one thing and then, try to charge you something differently. And if you don't have that amount of money, they'll reach out to your family and hold you until they're able to pay. So I don't want to minimize the reality of that. But there are people like Juan Javier who are in the book, who are young people that have learned these, how to, what the journey is and how to get across. And they've been able to figure out, when do the border patrol certain areas, and they're just doing business, just like you would do business with anyone else. And I wanted to highlight that, because that's not something that you ever see in media. Like I said, I don't want to minimize the stories that we do hear because it is true. But I'm also not, in the business of enough people tell those stories and the violence, the negativity of that. And I wanted to showcase something that was different, but also true.
Right on. Speaking of Darcy being, the border crossing, her group, El Jefe is the border crossed El Jefe as well, and his family. Can you tell us a little about the border's impact on wildlife?
Yeah. So, one of the things that you often don't hear about, but a lot of, activists who organize against the border wall and the fences will say is the impact that it has on wildlife, often protected wildlife. And like everything else that we've talked about, El Jefe is also a real jaguar. And that's actually his name, that people have named this actual real jaguar. And that's because his specific species of jaguar mostly resides on the Mexican side. And because of the border fencing, at the time of writing the book, he was stuck on the U.S. side. Also, like Mateo, separated from his family, and like so many other people. And if you Google, El Jefe jaguar or Sonoran Desert, you'll find images that were taken from like motion sensor cameras of people who track him. And I think it was like 2 or 3 months ago, he was actually spotted for the first time on the Mexican side since he was identified, and definitely since we started working on the book. But yeah, when I learned about El Jefe, it really struck me as a really deep parallel for, the experience that humans have, but the way that it also obviously affects wildlife.
Tell us a bit about the militias, the Border Patrol, and you have an interesting story within the story of a militiaman and his son, and I thought it was very interesting in the story that there's a lot of parental figures and these young people, and like not only do we see Mateo and his family, we see even Guillermo and his family, and Felipe's dad, and so it was interesting to have on the other side a militiaman and his son, and everybody's learning things from their elders, and this young man is being taught certain things and being brought out to the desert to join in the business that is partaking. Could you tell us a little bit about the militiamen and their or let's start with this militiaman and his son, and why you wanted to dive into that?
Yeah, I think it's a little cliched, but there is truth to it. That we aren't born, hating anyone. We aren't born racist. But oftentimes the way that we're brought up, whether it's environmental or the people that we're surrounded with, have these huge influences on us. And with Mateo, we see the influence of his family, and how much they care for him. So much so that they are willing to maybe never see him again because they want him to continue the life that he started and that they sacrificed so much for bringing him to the U.S. in the first place, right? And then on the other hand, we have this American kid who's running with this militia group, and he's being, you can tell from the mannerisms, the way that Jacoby drew him, and eventually through his words that he is incredibly uncomfortable. This might be the first or second time he's done it. But he's being raised within, amongst these people that believe that they have a right to go out in the desert and, patrol it and act like the Border Patrol. And, I always, sometimes we hear a lot about radicalization amongst teens. And a lot of times I feel bad for them, because they didn't wake up one day and start thinking this, something triggered it, and then, internet algorithms or, family members that they're surrounded with wound them up and kept feeding that into them, and then eventually they grow up and, this is a new normal to them. So I wanted to showcase that with this character, while also, again, using a real life scenario, which we saw 2 or 3 years ago of militias. There's a long history of militias patrolling the desert, starting with the KKK, like I mentioned before. But 2 or 3 years ago, there was footage that came out of these militia groups that literally kidnapped migrants at the border and held them at gunpoint. And like the other things I mentioned, that part of the story also came from our research.
Before we bring Dana in to ask some questions from those watching, I'd like to hear a little bit about what you guys are working on together, apart. And Jacoby, I think you were doing a little drawing over there. Could you share that with us?
Yeah, I could definitely share that. Let's see if the share screen will actually.
Yeah, your work was quite beautiful in this book, and
Thank you.
Just want to highlight that. So when I found you were going to be doing the drawing, I thought it was a wonderful treat for us.
Thank you. Let's see.
Can you tell us a little bit about character design and some of the choices that you made?
Character designs, I think with Mateo, I did want to avoid the typical like Mexican character with a red jacket, like a Coco, and I think there's another. I think it's Casa Grande.
That's the one.
Yeah, that's the one. So I want to avoid that. So because I think initially he did have a red jacket, and then I think I just saw a tweet that said it, and I was like, all right, let's not do that. But Guillermo, his design, I think, was pretty much stuck to like the references around the time and a lot of references from the Salcedo program. But I did want to add that, like, with Julio, he's a great collaborator, and one of the things that he let me do was a little bit of storytelling with his hat. Because initially this wasn't in the script, but with during the scene with Felipe, or like Guillermo's backstory, and him with Felipe, like Felipe gave him the hat, and when on his journey, like when he died, like Guillermo held the hat to him, and I think it was really cool that Julio was like down with the idea and really liked it.
Yeah, it was a great idea. I was like, when he told me about it, and it wasn't even anything. It was one of those really easy ones because nothing even had to be changed in the script.
Yeah.
But I thought it was like a really sweet touch that really even added more depth to his character and like his desire to, cross over to the afterlife after being stuck in the desert.
So I'm gonna show the live the drawing that I did. Is it showing?
Not yet.
Okay. Let's see.
While he works on that, I can talk about our next work together. I'll say my next book is this fall. It's called Si Se Puede, and the subtitle of it is The Latino Heroes That Changed the United States, and it's a nonfiction graphic novel that's illustrated by Yasmin Flores Montañez. And that'll be out October 10th, I think. But after that, Jacoby and I have got a few books together. We've got 3 books together. One of which has been announced. It's called Paco and Tiny, and it's our middle grade debut together. It's with First Second, and it's a story about a Cuban immigrant who comes to New York and befriends this really big dog, and they go on adventures around the city together. So it's very sweet and fun, and Jacoby's drawing that one already. And really just like, one of my favorite things about Jacoby is like the diversity of the art that he's able to do. Like his art styles, he's able to do something like Frontera that's, really grounded. And then with Paco and Tiny, it's, it's inspired by like all of the cartoons that we grew up with on, like early 2000s era Cartoon Network. And, the backgrounds remind me a lot of like 101 Dalmatians. which is so different from Frontera. But and then we got an IP book, a YA book that is based on existing IP that'll be announced soon. Comes out next year. And then we got one more that another YA that hasn't been announced yet. But
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
We're all looking forward to seeing that.
No idea.
You can just hold it up.
Yeah, I'm just going to do that instead.
Yeah. Let's get our eyes on this thing.
But yes, the idea was that I drew it during this conversation.
Awesome.
Nice.
But yeah, that's our boys, Mateo and Guillermo. They're so easy to draw now after 240 pages.
For those of you listening, creating a graphic novel, as Julio pointed to earlier, takes quite a bit of time. And as Jacoby well knows, by the end of the book, you can draw these characters in your sleep.
Yeah, that's a year drawing the same characters.
Yeah. So Dana, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, we do have a question or two. First one's for both the author and the illustrator. Ron says, hey guys, how much time did you both spend talking about how the illustrations would match the story? So how much like brainstorming was there before pen to paper happened?
Yeah. This is our first book. So I think the gestation time for it was a lot longer than with the projects that we've been working on now. So this book, Jacoby and I started working on short stories together, like 4 to 10 page mini comics that we just post online for free in 2019. And very soon after our first one, we started talking about Frontera. So that was 2019. We ended up signing the deal with the book, with the publisher in 2020. And then I don't think you started drawing until like 2021, right? Because after the script was done.
I mean, if we're talking for the actual publisher started drawing, 2020, 2021. But I mean, we did our pitch pages back in 2019.
Yeah, which was an evolution also, because when we first did the pages, for those of you who don't know, like when you're trying to get a graphic novel published, you do like sample pages to show publishers like this is what it's going to look like. Guillermo was green back then, and a man, a grown man. He wasn't a teenager. That was another change that happened. So I think with this book, it was 2 to 3 years of like, talking about it in different forms, whether it was just like the broad idea and then up until the point I wrote the script and we talked about it a lot more detailed. But usually Jacoby does a few rounds of character designs. I'll tell him what I'm thinking. We'll talk about it a lot even before then, where like now, we talk about it so much and then Jacoby does character designs. And then that's it. That's what the character looks like. We usually don't really even go much more back and forth beyond that. But I think that's also because we work together so much, and we're also just friends. Like we talk every day, and it's not always about our books.
We just watched the Barbie movie together today.
Yeah, we just got out of Barbie a few hours ago. But yeah, so I think it varies, but we work together so much that, it's quicker now than it was when we started this book.
Great. Actually, I have a question. How did you guys meet?
I slid into Jacoby's email one day. When I first started writing comics, I was looking for artists to work with on those short stories. And I went on Twitter, and oftentimes in comics, people will just post like, threads like telling artists like post your samples, like, and I'll share them to my audience, things like that. And I was just digging through so many of those when I was looking for artists that I thought their style matched like the tone of the stories I was doing. And I wish I could find it now, but in one of those threads was Jacoby. And I loved his art, so I just wrote him an email, and I guess the rest is history. But
That's awesome. It's good to just like put yourself out there as an artist.
Yeah. Scary, but I was trying to get my money.
I love it. There is another question from Susan. So this one's a little bit more complex. So I recently attended a discussion about the state of our democracy, whether our grand experiment will fail or survive. And I was surprised that the speaker said the central issue facing us today that will determine the answer to that fail survive question was the need to address and solve immigration. Can you comment on this view? That's a pretty heavy question, so I'll let you conquer it however you want.
You know, oftentimes when, especially around like presidential elections, you know, my central issue is immigration. And usually when people say that, their perspective is of how are we going to stop people from coming into the country, you know? But for me, where, you know, I'm the son of immigrants, you know, whether on one side of my family, it's Cuban immigrants who were granted asylum in the US and never had to worry about their legal status. And on the other side of my family from Colombia, they were undocumented. So, you know, two very different experiences, but both of them affected by US immigration policies. So for me, it's super important. But to the question of that being the central issue, I can certainly see the argument. And for me, it's because immigrants are so often the scapegoat, you know, for any administration. You know, we forget, you know, Trump was obviously, you know, the loudest and brashest version in recent history about, you know, with anti-immigrant sentiments. But we forget that, you know, Bill Clinton was also huge anti-immigrant proponent. You know, the border fencing started under him. So much of the policies that we have now are inherited from his administration. So, you know, one side, in quotes, is certainly more filled with vitriol and talks openly about their desire to clamp down on immigration and stop migrants from coming to the country, and they're less, you know, less embarrassed to say what they mean. And on the other side, you know, it's often indifference or hiding, you know, or doing it in a nicer way, you know, where, you know, they're proceeding with the same policies, but without the language that the Republicans use. So, you know, I think, you know, I remember, without going too much longer, I remember in 2008, you know, when I voted for Obama, and like the hope that I felt and how immigration was going to be the first thing that he worked on. And then he went the route of healthcare instead. You know, there have been opportunities, whether it was Obama having all aspects of government, you know, all three branches, to Biden also having all three branches, where a lot of times it feels like the country does not want to solve immigration. You know, it's too easy to use immigrants as a scapegoat, and to also, from the left, use immigrants as we are going to protect you from the right, when that often isn't the case either. So I agree with the premise, but I guess my view is a lot more, I don't know, negative that we will get there. But I do think that it's a huge humanitarian issue. You know, it shouldn't take crossing a desert and risking your life to come to the U.S. But unfortunately, for so many people, that's the only thing that they can do, because the opposite is just untenable for them. So yeah, so that's I guess that's my opinion based off of my understanding of the question, but I'm also probably not the best person to answer that.
Yeah, it's a big issue. That's why I was like, take your time with it. If anyone else wants to ask a question, there's just that little ask a question box, or you can do it in chat, whatever. There's just a few minutes left. So
I have a question. So Julio, you're in New York. Jacoby, you're in Portland. Is that
Uh,
right?
right now I am in New York technically, but I do live in Portland. I just came to visit for the release of the book and do some signings with Julio and really just hang out with Julio.
Nice, nice. So collaborating over distance is something that we do often in comics. But every collaboration has its own story. So could you tell us about your collaboration and the distance and how that affects it as well, or does it maybe it helps it, enhances, or
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about it?
The one thing I'll say about the distance is that Jacoby's a maniac who, like, I'll wake up to a text from him and it'll be like at a time that you'd expect. You know, he's in Portland, he's 3 hours ahead of me. So like maybe it was sent at like 2 in the morning my time, right? So like 11 p.m. And then I'll wake up at 7 and I'll respond and he'll respond immediately because he still hasn't gone to bed.
That was my first thought too.
Yeah, so that's all I'll say about the distance. But like I said before, Jacoby and I, you know, he's one of my best friends. We're talking all the time. You know, we're constantly sending things back and forth. Whenever I start exploring an idea, almost always, with very little exception, I go to him first and say, like, are you interested in this? You know, like, and I'll send them articles about like what is inspiring it, you know? And usually he says yes. And sometimes he's like, let Yasmin do that one, you know, or, you know, but yeah, you know, I think it's super collaborative, even in the idea stage, you know, because oftentimes, unlike Frontera, which I said, like, the ghost was there from the beginning, it's usually, most ideas usually start with, like a point of view, you know, like whether it's anger about the border and the way that immigrants are viewed, or it's, you know, wanting to tell a story about one of my upcoming books about a kid who struggles with speaking Spanish around, you know, amongst the rest of his family who are all fluent speakers. And Jacoby and I, since it starts at that like primordial stage, you know, he has a lot of input from that stage also, you know, and a lot of the things that he says will then influence where the idea goes and where my mind is. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a pretty collaborative process between the two of us. What do you
Are
think,
you doing
Jacoby?
full scripts and
Yeah.
are you writing on thumbnails? Like what's the back and forth like?
I'll say one
You
thing.
can share it.
I was just going to say that usually, like, when we start working like on an idea together, he sends me something. Like, we have a book that just sold recently, and he was telling me about it, and I think I get to, like, I know I want to work with him when I get super excited and I'm able to start drawing something. And I think that's also another fun part, is that he's able to then have a visual for how the book could look.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's also another fun part about the collaboration, is just that instant visual to his idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, that must be super helpful.
No, yeah, it definitely like inspires me with like now having a visual of what these characters can look like. But yeah, we usually work full script. We did try doing Marvel style once, and that by the end of it, Jacoby was like, "I don't want to do that again." But,
could you explain
yeah.
to our listeners what Marvel style is?
Oh, yeah.
Full script.
So full script is kind of like just writing like page 1, panel 1, character is walking into a room, panel 2, something catches their attention, and like any dialogue that you're going to put in between. And then Marvel style is just like a summary. And we tried doing, did we do it like page by page Marvel style, right? Is that what we did? Where it was like page 1, this is everything that should happen in page 1, and all the dialogue that should be on page 1. And then it was up to Jacoby to just take that and then panel it out however he saw fit. And I thought those pages turned out really well. Like I was really happy with it. But I think you, by the end of it, you were like,
I think it just maybe took up a lot more time than especially because I think this was for a pitch, and maybe if like it was something where I know we have the time to do it, It'd be cool, but yeah, that one was just like, all right. And also the dialogue part, I think I like knowing what a character is going to say or is saying.
Yeah.
Because then I can really try to match the expression as much as I can.
Yeah, and I one of the things we experienced a lot also was like changing dialogue in that, which then required changing expressions because it wasn't like mapped out. But you know, we discovered that maybe that's not the way forward.
Jacoby, have you ever influenced the dialogue based on when you were drawing, like edited
Oh, yeah.
the other way around?
Yeah, I've definitely texted Julio multiple times, like, hey, can the character say this instead? Or, can we just get rid of this?
Yeah. Yeah, you know, as a writer that cannot draw to save his life, you know, there's definitely times when Jacoby, you know, is like, I don't think we need this, you know, and then when I think about it, which is a thought that would have never occurred to me unless he said it, he's totally right, you know, and that's just because like I am not a comic book artist, and that's not like where my mind goes. But I do tend to visualize everything in my head when I'm writing it. But there's been a lot of moments where it's really enhanced the story where he's pointed things out and I'm like, oh yeah, let's just not do that.
Yeah, we have the benefit of a first reader and also, you know, a visual storyteller where sometimes oftentimes I'll have something drawn and then I realize, oh, I can cut out this dialogue or this scene or whatever it is. It's already said in the pictures, which is what, you know, this wonderful medium that we're working in is, you know, words and pictures in combination, and sometimes efficiency is born out of, you know, seeing it all laid out.
Definitely.
No, yeah. We are, I think, a well-oiled machine now. We can communicate. I'm sure it probably bugs Julio when I am staying up late and then sleep until 2 p.m. and he's like waiting on a response, like, come on, let's go.
No, there's definitely been moments when like our agent is emailing us something important and I'm like, he was texting me 2 hours ago, he was still awake, so I think he's going to be out for a while.
I've had that where I've worked with people in Thailand or where have people been? People have been all over the world that I've worked with, and the hours are completely bonkers. And but kind of like on my phone, I have all these time zones. Like when work, okay, like I can send an email to this person now or this person, you know, and trying to sync everything up, but it all comes through beautifully in the end. And
no one will ever know.
Yeah, all these all these experiences. Everyone's kind of. I worked with someone in Brazil, so like the course of their day was something different than the course of my day. So when they're sending art, you know, what they have for lunch, as Jacoby will tell you, influences what you draw. That like every little thing kind of influences you see on your walk. You know? So if you're working with people in a totally different country, totally different time zone, sometimes it's always a surprise getting pages back, but sometimes it's an extra surprise. You're not even put into the same frame of reference. Yeah. But you're working off of the same script. So that's your frame of reference. Yeah. But all the other references that are feeding into the work are complete surprises and delightful when you're the writer getting those scripts. And
I'll just shout out because that's you're talking about Crema, right? That book? That's a great book. Yeah. So good.
Thanks a lot. Thanks so much. Yeah, Dante Luiz was an incredible artist on that who lives in Brazil, and he made it sing, you know, which was really wonderful.
Johnnie, do you want to quickly say if you're working on anything that we should be aware of?
Yeah, I'm working on a book that should be out next summer, hopefully. It's about, for right now, I'll say it's about summer camp. And then there's some video game element kind of thrown in, and you could imagine the ways in which there's a juxtaposition that's born out of those two things. But it's really fun. I'm drawing it right now, and I'm having a blast.
Yeah, that's a perfect summer book, so I'll be excited.
And to anyone who's listening, if you haven't read Johnny's swim team book yet, please do. It's incredible, and was a big, I literally had it on my desk while I was working on my first middle grade book and just like reading it and referencing it. And I had little like post-it tabs on it of like pages I loved that I look at. So I highly recommend it to everyone.
Thanks, Julio. I appreciate that.
Okay, well, this has been amazing. I'm very excited about this new IP project that will be announced shortly, I'm sure. Or long, you know how publishing is. So, but thank you so much for being here. Thank you for all your guests for being here. Susan, I just wanted to say, she said thank you for that thoughtful response. So I just wanted you guys to know.
Of course.
So thank you. And of course, you can buy the book at Books and Books. The link is right below. Also just on our website. Yes. Oh, good. One last glimpse of it. Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you for having
Good night,
us.
everybody.
Good night.